Two hungry girls sitting alone under a sycamore in the heat that bent fences. He told himself it wasn't his concern, but when no one else stopped, Elias Ward did. He brought them home to a house hollowed by loss, never guessing that saving them would save him too. And when the town rose up to call him unfit, those same little voices stood beside him, proving that family isn't always born. Sometimes it's chosen. If you believe even a broken heart can build something lasting, stay with us. The heat was the kind that bent fences and silenced even the hungriest crows. Under the sycamore's trembling shade, two girls sat so still it seemed the world had forgotten them. Elias Ward first noticed them when he passed the schoolhouse on his way to the mercantile. It was a Tuesday. He remembered that because Tuesdays were the worst, quiet as an empty jar. The sky had turned the color of old brass, and sweat trickled from under his hatband. For a moment he thought the girls were nothing but sacks of flour left in the sun, but then the smaller one lifted her head, and he saw her eyes, pale, watchful, rimmed in dust. No one else on the road seemed to care. A wagon rattled by, the driver staring straight ahead. A pair of women from the church committee walked past without pausing, skirts flapping against their ankles. Elias stood there, the straps of his canvas sack biting into his palm, and told himself it wasn't his concern. He was nobody's keeper anymore. Not since Ruth died. Not since the fever took little Jonathan in the span of a single breath. But even as he turned to leave, something in the older girl's expression, some stubborn, strangled dignity, made his feet refuse to move. She had her arm around the smaller one, shielding her from the glare, though she was no bigger herself. Their dresses were the color of washed-out calico, hemmed too short, with stitches so crude they looked like a child's work. He saw the tremor in the taller girl's mouth when she tried to speak but made no sound. A stammer, he guessed, though she clenched her jaw as if she could force the words out by sheer will. The smaller one leaned against her, a limp in her right leg obvious even from a distance. Two little creatures too proud to beg, too tired to run. A hot wind kicked dust into his boots. Elias cursed under his breath, hating the tightness rising in his chest. The place inside him where pity had once lived had gone hollow these past 5 years, scraped clean by grief and the slow, punishing work of staying alive. And yet, here they were. 2 reasons to remember he was still capable of caring, whether he wanted to or not. He wiped the sweat from his brow, took a step forward, and heard his heart beat loud in the hush. When he spoke, his voice was rough as gravel. "You girls got any folks coming?" The taller one only shook her head. The smaller one's lip quivered, but she didn't cry. They looked at him as if bracing for a blow, and the sight made something deep in his chest crack, just a little. Elias drew a breath that tasted of hot dust and regret. He knew before they answered that no one was coming, and that if he turned away now, he would carry the shame of it for the rest of his days. Elias set his sack down on the scorched road, the canvas making a soft thud that startled the smaller girl. He crouched so he wouldn't tower over them. His knees complained, but he held still, hands braced on his thighs. Up close, he could see the brittle grime under their fingernails, the smudge of dirt across the taller girl's cheek. Her hair was a tangled snarl the color of chestnuts left too long in the rain. She looked at him with the wary stare of a barn cat, hungry enough to stay, too proud to creep closer. He cleared his throat and tried again, his voice low, careful. "Name's Elias Ward. I got a house out by the South Road, just a mile or so." Still nothing, only the weight of their silence pressing against his skin. He reached into his sack and pulled out a hard biscuit he'd bought that morning, wrapped in brown paper. He held it out, palm flat, as though offering it to a skittish animal. The taller girl's gaze flicked to the food, then back to his face, her jaw working like she was trying to swallow a stone. Slowly she reached out, took the biscuit and broke it clean in half. She gave the larger piece to the little one without a word. Elias felt his throat tighten at the simple, practiced gesture. How many times had she done that, divided whatever scraps she had to make sure the smaller one never went without? The wind shifted, carrying the ripe smell of horse dung and sun-baked earth. A wagon creaked past again, the driver peering down at them with open curiosity before moving on. Elias felt heat climbing the back of his neck, not just from the sun. He realized that any moment someone would start asking why he was standing there talking to 2 stray girls. and he'd have no answer that didn't sound like meddling. He swallowed, rubbed a thumb along the seam of his hat. "You can stay here if you want," he said, nodding to the patch of shade. "Or you can come with me. I ain't got much, but there's clean water, food." The taller one licked her cracked lips. When she finally spoke, her voice was little more than a whisper strangled by a stammer. "Clara." She touched her chest with 2 fingers. Then, her hand trembled as she rested it on the little one's shoulder. "Hazel." He nodded, pressing a hand over the ache blooming behind his ribs. "Clara, Hazel. All right then." He waited, willing himself to be patient, though the sun was climbing and the road would only get hotter. After a moment, Clara shifted, her skinny legs unfolding as she tried to stand. When Hazel tried to follow, her right foot dragged in the dust, pitching her sideways. Elias stepped forward on instinct and caught her before she could fall. She weighed almost nothing, her bony shoulder fitting neatly in the hollow of his palm. For a breath, Hazel went rigid, her eyes squeezed tight. Then she slumped against him with a tiny sigh, too tired to resist. He looked at Clara. Her lips parted as though she might protest, but she only nodded once, eyes fixed on the ground. A silent consent. Gathering Hazel into his arms, Elias straightened, feeling the sharp press of her spine against his chest. She didn't weigh more than a bundle of kindling. Clara rose unsteadily and gathered the scrap of calico that served as a satchel, pressing it to her chest. Together they began the slow walk down the road, past the indifferent faces in the windows, past the church steeple casting its long, judgmental shadow. Each step felt like stepping into something he didn't know how to name, something that frightened him more than he would admit. The house waited at the far edge of Sycamore Fork, a squat, weathered thing crouched among brittle grass and the ghosts of better years. Once Ruth had planted hollyhocks along the porch rail, their bright faces nodding in the breeze. Now the flower beds were nothing but dry ruts, and the shutters hung askew. Elias shifted Hazel higher against his shoulder, the boards creaking under his boots as he climbed the steps. He paused at the door, struck by how small it all felt now, this house that had once held a family. With a breath that tasted of old regrets, he pushed it open. The air inside was cool and stale, thick with the smell of wood smoke and thyme. He set Hazel carefully on the settee, her limp leg folding awkwardly until Clara rushed to straighten it. Neither girl spoke. Clara hovered over her sister with a ferocious gentleness that made Elias look away. He busied himself with the kettle, filling it at the pump and setting it to heat on the stove. He hadn't made tea for anyone but himself in years. He realized his hands were shaking. He kept his voice low when he spoke, afraid too much noise might send them skittering like startled birds. "You'll be safe here. Just make yourselves at home." Clara glanced up, her eyes searching his face for a lie. Finding none, she returned to smoothing Hazel's hair. Elias turned back to the stove. The old kettle hissed like an irritated snake, steam rising in soft curls. As he watched it, he remembered how Ruth used to hum when she poured water, a small, absent tune that filled the room with more comfort than the fire ever could. For a moment he almost heard it again, drifting through the hush. He carried 2 chipped mugs to the table, setting them down with a care that surprised him. Clara took hers with both hands. The tea was weak and bitter, but she drank without complaint. Hazel's lashes fluttered as she sipped, and Elias saw the fine tremor in her small fingers. He wanted to say something that might ease the fear in her, but no words came. So he sat across from them, silent, the 3 of them marooned together in a room that smelled of ashes and old sorrow. Outside, the afternoon heat pressed against the windows, trying to find a way in. Inside, the quiet was so thick, it felt alive. The girl's presence changed everything. Every corner of the house felt too large, too empty, as though it were holding its breath to see what they would do. Elias watched them over the rim of his cup. Clara's eyes kept darting to the door, and every time the wind rattled the shutters, Hazel flinched as if expecting someone to burst through. When the tea was gone, Elias stood and crossed to the old cedar chest by the hearth. He lifted the lid with slow care, the hinges groaning. Inside lay a folded quilt, washed so many times it had lost all its color. He carried it to the settee and draped it over Hazel's knees. Clara's gaze met his, wary and grateful all at once. He nodded, unable to hold her eyes for long. Something about the way she looked at him, like she was measuring the weight of his kindness, made him feel raw and unsteady. He retreated to the kitchen and busied himself with the stove, pretending he didn't see her watching him. The afternoon wore on. The kettle cooled. The girls sat without speaking, their small bodies drawn close together like two seedlings clinging to a patch of thin soil. And in that fragile hush, Elias felt the old walls exhale, as if the house itself recognized that something had returned, something he hadn't known he was waiting for. Morning came, wrapped in a pale hush, the sky washed clean by a rare night breeze. Elias woke before dawn, the habit of lonely years still etched in his bones. For a moment he lay in the dark, listening to the small sounds of another presence, the rustle of fabric as Clara shifted on the settee, the sigh Hazel made in her sleep. The house felt different, as though the walls themselves were leaning in, curious about these newcomers. He rose and dressed without lighting the lamp, preferring the soft gray of first light. In the kitchen, he built a small fire, fed it kindling until the coals glowed steady. He moved with deliberate quiet, unwilling to startle them. He cracked eggs into a tin bowl, whisking them with a fork whose handle had worn smooth. As he measured flour for biscuits, he tried to remember how Ruth used to do it. Pinches of salt, a careful splash of buttermilk, hands moving with unhurried grace. His hands were clumsy in comparison, the dough too dry. He worked it anyway, feeling the old ache in his knuckles. By the time the first light spilled across the floorboards, the kitchen smelled of browning batter, and coffee gone slightly bitter. He heard a tentative scuff of footsteps behind him, and turned to find Clara hovering in the doorway. She wore the same calico dress, its hem now torn where it had caught on a nail. Her hair hung in a crooked braid, likely her own doing. She was clutching Hazel's small frayed satchel against her chest. "You can sit if you like," he said, nodding to the table. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Clara hesitated, eyes darting to the stove, to the window, to the door. At last, she inched to a chair and folded herself into it, the satchel still held like a shield. He set a plate in front of her, 2 biscuits, steaming and imperfect. She stared down at them as if they were too much to believe. When she looked up, her mouth moved, and he saw the shape of thank you in the way her lips formed around the syllables, though no sound came. Hazel appeared next, hobbling on her uneven step, her hair a tumble of knots. Elias felt something clench inside him at the sight of her fragility. He fetched another chair, eased her into it. The moment her small hand brushed his knuckles, he felt that same rawness as before, a reminder that caring once claimed made its own demands. He poured coffee into his tin cup, watered it down for Clara. For Hazel he found an old enamel mug, cracked but clean. He added a splash of milk, watched her eyes widen in shy delight. They ate in near silence, the only sounds the soft scrape of forks and the tick of the cooling stove. From time to time, Clara's gaze flicked to him, cautious and measuring, as if she were waiting for the price of his kindness to reveal itself. After breakfast, Elias retrieved Ruth's mending basket from the cupboard. The sight of it, her neat spools of thread, her little bone-handled scissors, caught him like a fist in the chest. He set it on the table and met Clara's questioning stare. "I can fix the hem," he said, gesturing to her dress. "Or, if you'd rather, you can." Her mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before she nodded. With careful hands, she took the needle and threaded it, her small fingers trembling just enough to betray her nerves. She bent to her task with an intensity that made him look away. He busied himself with clearing the dishes, but every few heartbeats he glanced back, watched the way she tugged the fabric taut, the way Hazel leaned against her shoulder, their 2 heads almost touching. Something small and stubborn flickered in his chest, a sense that this morning, this simple ritual of mending, eating, being, was the first step in some unknown journey he hadn't chosen, but could no longer refuse. When Clara finished, she held the dress up for inspection, her eyes shy but proud. Elias nodded, unable to trust his voice. Outside, the sycamore leaves stirred in the breeze, catching the first warmth of the sun. And inside, for the first time in years, the house did not feel so empty. They settled into a rhythm that first week, an uneasy, tentative choreography of small routines and softer silences. In the mornings, Elias rose before dawn to split wood. the dull thunk of the axe steadying his thoughts. Sometimes he'd glance at the window and catch Clara's pale face watching him, half hidden behind the checked curtain. She never waved, never called out, but he felt her gaze like a weight, part wary curiosity, part fragile trust. Hazel often woke crying, her small voice cracking with terror no one could name. Those nights, Elias would light the lamp and sit by the settee where she slept. The flames glow, painting shadows up the walls. He never touched her. He'd learned enough about fear to know how much distance could matter. But he spoke in low, even tones, telling stories of the trees out back, of how the sycamore's roots ran so deep they could drink rain no drought could steal. Sometimes he thought she listened. Sometimes she only cried until she fell asleep again, her face blotched with sorrow too old for her years. As days wore on, the girls began to claim small corners of the house. Clara arranged Hazel's meager belongings on a shelf by the window, a broken-handled hairbrush, a ragged doll missing one button eye, a pebble smooth as glass. She set them out with such care it made Elias's throat tighten. He remembered Ruth doing the same with Jonathan's toys, believing a house only became a home when children's treasures found their place. In the evenings he read from the Bible, not because he was pious, but because the words filled the hush with something steadier than loneliness. Clara would sit with her hands folded tight, her gaze fixed on the knot in the floorboards. Hazel leaned against her side, eyes drooping as the cadence of the verses washed over her. Now and then, Elias would look up and catch Clara studying him, as though trying to reconcile this quiet man with whatever stories she'd been told of the world's cruelties. He never asked what had happened before the sycamore tree, and she never volunteered it. Some truths he suspected were too tender to bear the air. On the third night, a summer storm rolled in, the sky bruised with thunder. The wind struck the house in heaving gusts, rattling the windows in their frames. Elias was banking the fire when Hazel's scream split the dark. It wasn't a child's cry of surprise. It was the raw, ragged wail of someone expecting pain. He dropped the poker and ran to the settee. Clara was already there, arms around her sister, but Hazel's small body thrashed, her heel striking the wooden leg of the seat with a hollow crack. Elias crouched beside them, careful to keep his hands in sight. His voice came out hoarse with urgency. "Hazel, listen to me. It's only wind. It can't get in. You're safe." Her sobs broke into hitching gasps, her eyes squeezed shut. Clara rocked her in a rhythm that felt practiced, her own tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Elias wanted to do something, anything to ease that old terror. He pressed his palm flat to the floorboards, feeling the steady thrum of the earth beneath them. "Feel that," he said, voice softer now. "That's the ground holding you up. Storm or no storm, it doesn't let go." Clara looked at him then, really looked, as though she'd been waiting to see if he would break or leave or shout. When he did none of those things, something shifted behind her damp lashes, a trembling kind of relief. The storm spent itself by midnight. Hazel finally fell into an exhausted doze, her small hand curled in Clara's skirt. Elias rose, knees aching, and fed the fire one last log. The glow flickered over the room's worn corners, revealing in that moment a truth he could not deny. He had thought he was saving them, but in the hush that followed the storm, he wondered if it was they who were saving him. By the second week, Sycamore Fork had begun to notice. In a town so small that every birth, death, and scandal echoed for years, two strange girls lodging with a widower were a story too rich to ignore. It started with sidelong glances at the mercantile, Mrs. Talbot's pinched mouth twitching as Elias bought extra flour, the shop boy sneaking curious peeks at Hazel's limp when she ventured to stand by the doorway. Then came the hushed conversations in the church vestibule, where hands fluttered over hymnals and voices dropped to whispers whenever he entered. Elias felt the weight of their suspicion pressing against his back, a prickling certainty that he and the girls were being measured and found wanting. One afternoon he caught Victor Hale watching his porch from across the road. Victor was the sort who'd always wanted a reason to feel superior, slim as a fence rail, with the permanent squint of a man searching for someone else's failings. He gave Elias a brittle smile, all teeth and malice. "You've taken on quite a burden," Victor said, nodding toward the house as if it were a scandal in plain sight. Not many men would invite such responsibility. Elias didn't answer. He lifted Hazel from the wagon bed, her small arms clutching his neck, and carried her inside without a backward glance. But that night, as he sat at the table mending the frayed hem of Hazel's petticoat, his hands moved slower. The needle shook between his fingers. He told himself it was only the strain of work, but the truth was a darker, heavier thing. He knew how quickly a whisper could become a verdict in a place like this. A few days later, Miss Corbin arrived unannounced. She stood on the porch in her blue calico dress, her hat pinned neat as scripture. Her expression was polite, but her gaze swept over the girls with cool appraisal. "I've come to see how Clara and Hazel are settling," she said, her voice pitched loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Elias stepped aside to let her in. The girls shrank back against the settee, Clara's hand curling protectively over Hazel's knee. Miss Corbin's eyes softened a fraction when she took in Hazel's thinness, the pallor that still hadn't left her cheeks. "You girls may go and wash up," she murmured, and waited until they had shuffled down the hall before turning to Elias. "You understand, Mr. Ward, that people are concerned. 2 young girls, no kin, living under a man's roof. Some feel it would be more appropriate for them to be placed with a woman." Her words were carefully chosen, but they landed with the blunt force of accusation. Elias felt something in his chest go cold. He folded his hands together to keep from shaking. "And who exactly would take them?" he asked, his voice low. "Mrs. Talbot, with 10 mouths already to feed? Or the Carsons, who can barely keep their own children clothed?" Miss Corbin's mouth pressed into a line. She did not answer. Instead, she surveyed the kitchen, her gaze lingering on the clean plates, the folded quilts, the small pair of shoes drying by the stove. When she spoke again, her voice had softened by a hair's breadth. "Even so, there are procedures. Victor Hale has petitioned the county clerk to review their placement." A pulse beat hard in Elias's throat. "You think I'd harm them?" "No," she said quietly, and for the first time her gaze met his without judgment. "But this town has a way of deciding things for itself." They stood there in the hush, the only sound the tick of the mantel clock. In that moment, Elias knew what he had feared all along, that this fragile belonging he'd stumbled into could be torn away by people who didn't understand it. Miss Corbin sighed and set a hand lightly on the back of a chair, her gloved fingers tapping once before she turned to leave. "I'll do what I can to speak in your favor," she murmured, "but you should prepare yourself." When she had gone, Elias sank into the chair she'd touched. He closed his eyes and pressed his palms to the table's scarred wood, feeling the old familiar ache of helplessness rising like a tide. In the next room, Clara's voice drifted in, a soft, stammering whisper trying to soothe Hazel's fretful whimpers. He thought of the first time he'd held his own child in the dark, Ruth's tired smile a lamp in the shadows. He thought of the promise he'd made at a graveside years ago, that he would never love so much again if it meant this kind of pain. But life had proven him a liar. He bowed his head and whispered a single voiceless prayer. "Let me keep them." 3 days later, the summons came on thin yellow paper, the ink smudged from the clerk's careless hand. Elias stood in the doorway with it clutched between his fingers, the words blurring and reforming as if they might change if he looked long enough. "Notice of inquiry regarding custodial fitness." The phrase felt clinical, distant, but it held the power to shatter everything that had begun to root itself in the quiet corners of his home. When he lifted his gaze, Clara was watching him from across the room, her small body gone rigid as a coiled spring. Hazel sat at her feet, turning her ragged doll over and over in her lap, oblivious to the tide about to rise. He folded the paper, slipped it into the pocket over his heart, and made himself smile, though it felt like splitting bone. "Nothing you need to worry over," he said, his voice as gentle as he could make it. But the lie tasted bitter, and Clara did not look convinced. The hearing was set for a week's end. In that time, the gossip spread like brush fire. Neighbors who once offered nods turned their faces to the ground. At the mercantile, Mrs. Talbot pretended not to see him at all, her hands fluttering among the shelves as though the jars might leap to arrange themselves. Victor Hale, emboldened by the silence of others, began stopping passers-by on the boardwalk to share his version of events, a story in which Elias was a lonely widower so starved for company he'd taken in strays to fill the hollow rooms of his house, never mind decency. Elias bore it in grim silence. Each evening he came home to the same small voices waiting to ask, "Will we have to leave?" He had no words to give them, only the same steady presence, setting water to boil, slicing bread, mending hems. He knew that the only defense he could offer was the truth of their days together. No hidden harm, no unkindness, nothing but the slow, clumsy making of a family. When the morning of the hearing dawned, Clara woke early, her hands fluttering over her calico dress as if she could smooth away the fear stitched into every seam. She tried to braid Hazel's hair but gave up halfway through, her fingers too unsteady. Elias took over, combing each tangle with careful strokes. The small act felt as intimate as prayer. Hazel leaned her head against his chest, and in that moment he knew there was nothing in this world or the next he would not do to keep them safe. They set out on foot. The road to the schoolhouse, borrowed for the hearing, was lined with cottonwoods whispering in the morning breeze. Elias walked beside Clara. Hazel perched on his hip, her thin arm looped around his neck. Now and then Clara's stammer broke the hush. Will they take us?" she whispered, her voice splintering. "Not if I can help it," he said, and he meant it with every ragged piece of his heart. When they reached the schoolhouse steps, a hush fell among the dozen onlookers gathered to see how the story would end. Victor Hale waited by the door, the papers in his hand, a proclamation of triumph he did not try to hide. Miss Corbin was there too, her gaze steady as she met Elias's eyes. She inclined her head, a silent promise that he would not stand alone. Inside, the benches had been moved to make space for the small assembly. Judge Abernathy sat behind the teacher's desk, spectacles perched low on his nose. His hair was white as milkweed fluff, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. As Elias crossed the threshold carrying Hazel, he felt the hush settle like a net around them. He set Hazel gently on the front bench, and Clara climbed up beside her, clutching her hand so tight their knuckles blanched. Judge Abernathy cleared his throat. "Mr. Ward," he began, voice grave but not unkind. "You stand here today in answer to the claim that you are unfit to keep these children in your home. Do you understand the seriousness of this proceeding?" Elias nodded. The words stuck behind the hard knot in his chest. "Then speak," the judge said. "Tell us why you believe they should remain." The room waited, every eye on him, every breath held. And in that stillness, Elias realized that this was the moment he would lay bare the truth, that he needed them as much as they needed him. That love had crept into the spaces left by loss, binding them together in a quiet, resolute way no accusation could unmake. He took a breath that tasted of fear and hope all tangled together, and he began. Elias's voice was low at first, a rough rasp that seemed too small to fill the schoolhouse. But as he spoke, something inside him steadied. He told them about the first morning he'd found the girls under the sycamore, how they had not cried or begged, only watched him with a silence so deep it felt like a challenge. He spoke of Clara's careful hands dividing a crust of bread in perfect halves, of Hazel's limp the way she had clung to her sister when the thunder came. He did not embellish. He did not plead. He simply laid out the small, homely truths of their days together. Biscuit crumbs on the table, mended hems, the hush that had slowly softened from suspicion to belonging. They were alone, he said, voice ragged. And I reckon I was too, though I'd never have owned it before. A murmur moved through the watchers, but Judge Abernathy raised one veined hand, and the hush returned. Elias swallowed, feeling the weight of every eye. "I won't pretend I know all that a man should about raising girls, but I can promise this. They've had a clean bed every night, food on the table, no hand raised to them, and whatever else folks may think, I reckon that counts for something." Miss Corbin stepped forward then, clearing her throat. "If it please the court," she said, her voice steadier than Elias had ever heard it, "I have observed Mr. Ward's care. The children have not only been fed and clothed, but treated with respect and gentleness. I believe removing them would do harm." Victor Hale shifted, the papers in his hand rattling. "Your Honor," he began, his tone slick as oil, "the question isn't whether Mr. Ward means well. It's whether he is fit, a man alone with no wife to oversee the propriety." But before he could finish, a sound interrupted him. a small, trembling voice trying to push through a barricade of fear. Clara had risen to her feet, her thin shoulders quivering. She looked from Victor to the judge, and when she spoke, the stammer tore through every syllable like a storm. "He is kind," she gasped, her cheeks flaming. "He doesn't hurt us. He never—" Her voice failed, but she pressed her lips tight, fighting for breath. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Even Victor's mouth hung open, the words stalled on his tongue. Hazel tugged at Clara's sleeve, her small hand finding purchase in the fabric. She leaned forward on the bench, her own voice a shy whisper. "We want to stay." Elias felt the world tilt under him. For the first time in years, his eyes blurred. He looked at the girls, Clara with her chin lifted, Hazel with her gaze locked on the judge, and knew that whatever came next, these two children had claimed him in ways nothing else ever had. Judge Abernathy drew in a breath, heavy with the solemnity of decision. He removed his spectacles and folded them carefully before meeting Elias's eyes. "I have heard enough," he said, voice gentler than any had expected. "It is clear to me that this is not a matter of impropriety, but of community failing to understand what makes a family." Victor made a sputtering sound of protest, but the judge did not look at him. Instead, he turned to Clara. "Miss, you are brave to speak so. And you," he said to Hazel, "have more courage than many grown folk I've known." He rested his hands on the desk, the finality of the gesture ringing louder than any gavel. "This court finds no cause to remove these children from Mr. Ward's care. Legal guardianship is hereby granted, effective immediately." For a moment, the room held its breath. Then Hazel buried her face against Clara's arm, and Clara's own tears fell unchecked. Miss Corbin bowed her head, a smile ghosting across her sober face. Even Victor, robbed of his triumph, could only stand there clutching his papers as if they might yet conjure a different outcome. Elias felt something unspool in his chest, a tightness he hadn't known he was holding. He knelt by the girls, resting one calloused hand on each of their shoulders. "It's done," he whispered, voice breaking on the last word. "You're mine now, as long as you'll have me." And for the first time since the fever stole his wife and son, he felt the quiet weight of purpose settle into all the empty spaces inside him. The next days unfolded like the first cautious hours of spring, still cold at the edges, but threaded through with a promise neither of them dared name. Word of the judge's ruling traveled faster than Elias could have guessed. By sundown, the town's whispers had shifted, no longer about suspicion, but about something softer, harder to admit. Perhaps pity, perhaps respect, perhaps a quiet shame at having stood by as two children were left to the mercy of rumor. That evening, Miss Corbin returned with a bundle of calico scraps, claiming she had no more use for them but offering them all the same. Clara accepted them with solemn gratitude, fingers smoothing each worn pattern as if they were treasures beyond price. The next morning, Mrs. Tobit's eldest boy appeared with a loaf of bread and a jar of preserves, eyes darting everywhere but Elias's face as he stammered that his ma said it was just extra. One by one, others followed. Mr. Finley with a small sack of oats, the Branson sisters with a hand-me-down dress just Hazel's size. Each offering carried the unspoken admission that judgment had come easy and compassion late. Elias did not know what to say to any of it. He only nodded, accepted the gifts with a thank you too small to cover the enormity of it all. That night, after the girls had washed and changed into clean clothes, he sat on the porch and watched them chase fireflies among the tufts of brittle grass. The lamp inside glowed warm against the windows, the house no longer looking so hollow. Every so often, Clara would glance back to be sure he was still watching, as though she needed the reassurance that he had not vanished now that the danger was past. Hazel's laugh rang out, high and bright as a bell. It startled something loose inside him, a memory of Jonathan at 4, squealing with delight when Ruth lifted him high enough to touch the rafters. The ache came, as it always did, but it did not hollow him out. It filled him instead, the grief mingling with a quieter gladness. Ruth's absence would never fade, but it no longer felt like an unbroken night. When the girls grew tired, he carried Hazel inside, her cheek pressed to his collarbone. Clara followed, her hand brushing the doorframe as she stepped over the threshold. It struck him how easily they fit here now, how their small presence softened the sharp corners of every room. In the kitchen, the mended hem of Clara's dress fluttered as she moved to set out the supper plates. Hazel curled up on the settee, her thumb rubbing the ragged ear of her doll. He sat at the table and watched them, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that this fragile thing they'd built could last. That family was not always blood or law, but the daily choosing to stay when it would be simpler to leave. The quiet courage to hold on when the world said you were unfit, unworthy, undone. Miss Corbin visited again the following Sunday, her hair pinned neat beneath her bonnet. She stayed longer this time, helping Clara piece the calico scraps into something like a quilt. Hazel fell asleep against her shoulder as she worked. When she left, she touched Elias's arm lightly, her voice hushed. "You've done more good here than you know," she said. After she was gone, Elias stood in the doorway and watched the sun sink behind the sycamore. The heat of the day had passed, and a thin breeze stirred the grass. The same tree that had once shaded two forgotten children now sheltered something new. A home made, not by accident, but by the slow, stubborn work of love. And as twilight gathered, he understood that this was not a rescue, not a sacrifice. It was a redemption neither he nor the girls had dared to hope for. The last of the light faded, leaving the yard bathed in a silver hush. Fireflies kindled and vanished among the weeds, their small lanterns flickering like promises. Elias stood on the porch a long while, his hand resting on the rail where Ruth once leaned to call him in from the fields. In those quiet minutes, he let himself feel it all, the old sorrow that would never leave him entirely, the new tentative gladness growing up around its roots. The girls were inside, their soft voices drifting through the open window, and he knew if he turned, he would see them in the lamplight, heads bent close over the quilt they were making from Miss Corbin's scraps. The world beyond the sycamore was unchanged. Victor Hale still prowled the boardwalk, no doubt cursing the judge's ruling. The Talbots still measured worth in whispers and sidelong looks, but the house itself felt anchored in a way it never had before, stitched together by countless small decisions to stay, to trust, to try again. After a time, he stepped back inside. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded, to his tired heart, almost like a benediction. Clara looked up, her hands stilled on the patchwork square in her lap. Hazel was already half asleep against her shoulder, her thumb hooked in the hem of Clara's dress. The lamplight gilded them in a gentle glow, and Elias felt something settle in his chest, a sense that the last of winter had finally receded, though the calendar still claimed it was summer. "Time for bed," he said softly, and Clara nodded. She eased Hazel upright, careful not to wake her fully, and together they crossed the room to the small chamber Elias had made ready for them. He watched the door close behind them, the latch sliding home with a quiet finality that felt like the drawing of a new map, one in which he was no longer just a solitary man waiting out the years. He banked the fire, washed the supper dishes, set the kettle for morning. Every movement was familiar, yet transformed by the knowledge that he was no longer alone. He thought of the first day he'd seen them under the sycamore, how he'd tried to convince himself that it wasn't his concern, how he'd believed his heart had gone barren as the fields in drought, and how wrong he'd been. Later, when the house had gone still, he stepped onto the porch once more. The moon had climbed high, pale as an old scar, throwing silver across the yard where Clara's rag doll lay forgotten in the grass. A cicada droned somewhere near the fence line, its steady rhythm as reassuring as a heartbeat. He sat on the top step, elbows on his knees, and looked out at the sycamore's broad branches. In the darkness, it seemed to shimmer with life, as if it remembered the day it first offered shelter. Elias tipped his hat back and closed his eyes. He thought of Ruth, and of Jonathan's laughter, of all he had lost. But he thought, too, of Clara's voice in the courtroom, of Hazel's small hand on his sleeve, of the simple, stubborn way they had chosen to stay. In that moment, he understood something he had never dared to believe. Love did not vanish when it was spent. It returned in new shapes, unexpected and undeniable, asking nothing but the courage to say yes. When he opened his eyes, the yard was just a yard again. Moonlight, grass, the worn boards beneath his boots. But the emptiness was gone. In its place was something tender and unbreakable, a belonging forged not by blood or law, but by 1,000 quiet acts of faith. And for the first time in many years, Elias Ward felt no need to measure his worth by what he had lost. He measured it instead by what he had found. Two small hearts trusting him to stand fast, and the certainty that he would.